very bare bones presentation. Subletting, as you all know, is a very complicated process, and it really depends on the people who are actually participating in it. Before we kind of jump in, we're going to do some quick introductions. My name is Angie Sosa. I am the Associate Director for Residential Operations in the Office of Residential Life and Learning. A big part of what I do in our office, outside of helping students kind of get settled in their rooms, is also working with the off-campus student population. I'm joined here today by Brooke Crafson, who's one of our student staff members. Brooke, I'll have you introduce yourself a little bit. Oh, maybe you can't mute. Okay, try that one.
Hi, I'm Brooke Crafson. I'm a junior and I work for Residential Life as the off-campus student coordinator. So I currently live off campus. I know what it's like to go through that and have to deal with a lot of stuff. So hopefully I can answer some questions that you have if you want a student to answer them.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So this is going to be fairly quick. A big part of this presentation is to gauge information, to provide you with some general basics of how to go through the subletting process, and then also introduce our new Canvas site, which we're going to make available to all of the students who are in need of this process. This is going to be a way for you to connect with your peers and really ensure that you're able to ask those questions and get that information. I know a lot of times when students come to me and they ask, how can they find people? You know, we've got our off-campus housing website, but it's not very easy to communicate with people if they're not checking their emails all the time. The same goes for, you know, not everyone has Facebook or anything like that. And so we thought hard about what's going to be a good venue for tough students to really ensure that they're able to connect with one another. It's not something that is difficult to utilize, especially because many of you already utilize this system for your classwork, and you have the opportunity to opt in. We'll be posting things from here to there. We've got a couple of discussion boards up. So right now it's very bare bones, but it is something that we're building out and really want to ensure that students have this opportunity. So during this presentation, we are going to go through a number of things. You can feel free to put any questions that you might have in the chat box, and either myself or Brooke will address them as they come up. We'll have a big section towards the end for additional questions. And then we have a few QR codes throughout the presentation for a couple of things. One that's going to take you directly to the Canvas site so that you can register to be a part of that course. And then two, the second one is specifically for a Qualtrics form so that we can collect your questions. We can form a frequently asked questions section. I'm not a fan of really just assuming what students need. I have an idea of some of the challenges that you all focus or deal with, and I know that there are a lot of students who are going through the same thing. And so a lot of times I'm using my experience having conversations with students and doing general research on housing and whatnot in the outside of Tufts area, to really help inform you all of how to move through the process, what are some typical things that you're going to see, and then in addition to that, how to move forward, how do you deal with any issues that pop up. Subleasing, for those of you who do not know, is essentially renting your space to another person. You're renting your space, but if you need, for any reason, someone to take over your space, whether it's you're going abroad or you're, going to be graduating early, if you need someone for the summer, maybe there's another situation. Perhaps you're taking a leave of absence. Perhaps you and your roommates don't get along anymore and you're like, I need to get out of this situation. These are all things and all reasons why students do choose to look into this process. It is complicated only because you do want to ensure that you are following all the necessary steps to make sure your landlords are okay with it, make sure your housemates are okay with it, and kind of go from there. Of course, something to really pay attention to is subletting versus assigning. And I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a breakdown of the difference between the two. When you sublet from another person, you are renting it from that person, but that person is still on the lease, meaning that person is still responsible for everything that happens within that space, whether it's covering the rent, if it is any damage that happens. Those are all things that that person is going to be responsible for. As a subletter, you're going to answer to them. You're going to be paying them most of the time. There are some caveats here and there, which I will go over, but those are things to really keep in mind. Then you have what's called assigning your lease. Basically, this means you're turning over all of your responsibility from that lease to another person. Now, most landlords are much more comfortable with subletting than assigning, but it really depends on your landlord. I'm going to talk a little bit about their involvement in the process because it does vary from landlord to landlord, but want to ensure that you all understand like what are the appropriate steps in making sure that you're going through the process as best as possible. So some important things to note is you really need to be sure that your lease allows subleasing. I've taken a screenshot below of a standard lease. So if any of you live off campus or if you're looking at leases, this is typically what it's going to say. It essentially says that you are not allowed to sublet your space without the permission of the landlord. That's what all that legal jargon says. Or if if you're have children, adopt, whatever the case is, that's something that needs to be, built in as well. But at the end of the day, you need the landlord's permission to have somebody other than yourself living in the space because you're the one that is assigned to the space. Should really ask the landlord if it is approved, is there any particular process that you should follow? Most times you're going to have a variety of three main reasons or three main things that the landlord's going to really pay attention to. One, they want to know who's going to be living in my space. I'm sure that when you're looking for off-campus housing or in any of the experiences you've had, you've kind of had to get either a credit check or have somebody sign on as a co-signer or a guarantor. That basically means that you're a trustworthy person and we can rent to you. But when you sublet to someone, the question is that person going to be following the same protocol? Do they go through the same process that I went through? Because they are renting from you, it's a little bit different. Some landlords kind of want to be hands off. You deal with it. That's totally on you. At the end of the day, the rent is due. And if they don't pay you, you're still responsible for paying the rent. The landlords, at the end of the day, I'm going to get my money. That's how they're looking at it. You have some landlords who are very involved in the process. They want the potential sublessor to fill out an application, submit a deposit, speak with them directly about all the processes, which in many ways, if they're having that level of involvement, it might be better to just assign the lease. Now, the difference between assigning the lease and subletting comes in here because you're really thinking about the length of time that this person is going to be utilizing the space. It's one thing if you're in the space for half the time and then the other 6 months you need to sublet to another person. If you don't plan on being back in that space from X time to the end of the lease date, subletting is not a big deal, or assigning is not a big deal. However, if you're looking to sublet your space over the summer, assigning is not something you want to do because you're the person that's going to be taking over afterwards. And at the end of the day, you want to be covered by the terms of that lease and to ensure that everything is okay. Along with the subtenants, you got to make sure that you're interviewing them as though you're interviewing a new roommate. You want to make sure that, they have the same, goals of the house as you all, that you're comfortable living in this space, that, say for instance, you're more of a quiet, more reserved person. You're not going to have a lot of people over. Is this subletter someone who's going to come in and throw parties all the time? What's that going to look like for you? The other thing to keep in mind is if they're subletting for you, despite the fact that maybe they're throwing parties, they could be getting in trouble with the landlord, and that could really have negative effects for you. So those are things to keep in mind. The other thing is to really include your roommates and your housemates in that process. You want to make sure that they're okay with it because they're the ones that have to live with that person. Sometimes that can be really difficult. And so I'll advise students to really check in with their friends, with their housemates, and say, if you have someone that you know who's potentially looking for something and wants to sublet from me, let me know. Let's be involved in the process. They may want to be a participant in interviewing some of the people. You want to make sure that at the end of the day, they're not going to make it difficult for your housemates and they're not going to make it difficult for you. You're going to see QR codes at the bottom of these presentations or presentation slides, excuse me. This one in particular does lead to our Qualtrics form, which allows you to submit questions to help us for our frequently asked questions section. You can also, write in some specific questions, whether you're putting it in our chat box or in this as well. You have the opportunity to leave your email address and we can contact you directly. So things to keep in mind and ask yourself. Whereas the landlord can determine if subleasing is something they're going to allow, they have to have a good reason to not allow you to do that. I have not been able to find a whole lot outside of a tenant's helper for the city of Somerville that really mentions, whether or not subletting is allowed. As you can see on that example that I showed you before, you just need to get, you need to get approval from the landlord. Now, sometimes you're going to have a lease that does say in the addendum, which is all the information that comes after the lease, essentially is the landlord saying, okay, for my particular space, I don't want this, I don't want this, you're not allowed to do this, you can do this, maybe I'll charge you this, whatever the case is. Sometimes it will counter what is in the original lease. So that is something to keep in mind. Whereas the standard lease says, yeah, just let the landlord know, the addendum may say, no subletting at all. Speak with the landlord about why that is. At the end of the day, I don't want anybody to be uncomfortable and miss out on anything that they feel is going to be a good space for them to live because of some questionable ideals. But at the end of the day, if you really need that as an option, that could be a potential deal breaker during your search. You want to make sure that you connect with them before you sign the lease. Those are questions that you want to ask the landlord. Be sure that that is something they'll even allow. Make sure that it is written out on the lease that they will allow that pending whatever stipulations. You don't want to be caught in a situation where, yeah, they said we couldn't do it, but we're going to do it anyway. That is something that could potentially lead to eviction. And eviction is not cool because it happens fairly quickly. You're still going to owe all the money at the end of the day. And then you're going to still have to try and find a location to live. So let's try to keep our feet out of hot water and follow all those rules as necessary. Students who may be going abroad, I usually kind of mention this as a potential option. If you are perhaps going abroad in the fall semester and your friend is going abroad in the spring semester, is that a situation where the two of you can just swap spaces? That makes the process a lot easier for locking in somebody. Hopefully you have similar friend groups and it's okay with everyone, but that is a good thing. But we realize that not everybody is the same. Not everybody has the same friend groups or, even has a group of people that they're comfortable with living with or knows people who are going abroad in a separate semester. And so that's a big reason why we started the Canvas site, to really make sure that you all have the opportunity to connect with one another. The other option, and is potentially the more uncomfortable version for a lot of Tufts students, is whether or not you're opposed to allowing someone who's not from Tufts to sublet. And when I say that, as you all know, we're surrounded by a lot of different schools in the area. There are people from other schools who are looking for sublets, whether they're looking for it over the summer, whether they're looking for it, for a semester, whatever the case is. That's something to really keep in mind. Our off-campus website does share a lot of information with other schools in the area. Many other schools do utilize the same platform that we have. And so a lot of their information, a lot of student profiles will be posted there. The cool thing about that particular website is that you can kind of give details about yourself, details about the house, the rent, all of that stuff. The Canvas site is more particular to Tufts students directly. It's all stuff that you're going to have to really think of what's going to be the most helpful information I need to share with someone, but it's not going to give you that prompt that our website will do. I also recommend posting in more than one location. If you do have a Facebook, maybe that's something that you post on. We recommend posting in the Facebook classes, the Facebook class pages, excuse me. Also on our off-campus website, which you don't have to pay for to post there. You just go to the roommate section as opposed to just the housing section. You can post photos of the room, the space, you know, et cetera. And then also on this Canvas site, we've made it available so that you all can start discussions. You can have the chat function. You can upload photos of the space if that's what helps. And then communicate with everybody. You know, I think what's really important is sometimes students, a lot of times will say, well, I posted that I had a space available, but nobody has contacted me. Okay, but also look for people who may say, hey, I am in need of a space, and vice versa. It's really important to kind of work together to find one another, if that makes sense. So this is the information that I was mentioning a little bit earlier, specifically regarding the Tenants Helper Handbook, which kind of goes over the specifics of subtenancies. I've highlighted kind of the important things to really pay attention to, and I'll kind of summarize for you. As I said in that top section there, it basically says the landlord has to have a good reason to not allow you to do this. You know, it's gives you the difference between a sublet and an assignment. Those are two different things, as I mentioned. And so those are all things that you need to get that like agreement from the landlord for. Typically some things that kind of pop up are, you know, a subtenant might decide, and by the way, I'm using different words because they are referred to as different things. There can be a sublessee, a subletter, a sublessor, a subtenant. So just be aware that those are the different types of phrasing and terminology that's going to be used throughout this process. They will pay rent. They could pay the, you know, total rent that's due. Say, for instance, the cost of your room is $900. You could say, yeah, you can stay in this space. The rent is $900, and that's totally fine. And if they agree to it, then fantastic. If you're having issues with locking in someone because of the price, then maybe you consider, should I maybe come down in a price a little bit and only be responsible for a portion? I've had students who are, you know, oh yeah, I'm going to list this space for $800 and I'm just going to pay the difference of $100. That way it's still able to be rented. You're still making a deal for someone, and it's not, it's still money that you have to pay, but not as much as you would have to pay if you didn't have somebody. It is important that the owner knows that there is someone subletting in the space. Sometimes owners are going to come in, they're going to do maintenance work or anything like that in case of emergency, whatever the case is. Imagine being in their shoes if they're, you know, mowing the lawn or something, and they see someone who they don't remember signing a lease to entering their building. That can be very off-putting. So it's very important to be very upfront and honest with the landlords about that. They may or may not have contact with the subletter. Like I said, some landlords just want a different relationship with that process. Sometimes they want to be more involved and sometimes they don't. That's all at the discretion of the landlord and a conversation topic that you really want to have with them. Specifically about paying the rent or dealing with any issues or anything like that. If you're the person that's on the lease and your landlord prefers that you're the one that communicates with them, you're kind of the landlord for that subtenant. So make sure that they're kind of giving you that information. Or, you know, keeping in mind, many of you are going to be in spaces that have multiple students. So my assumption is that there's going to be at least one person in the house that is on the original lease and maybe can help with, you know, diverting some of those processes. That's something to really talk about. This last point does mention that the landlord has not made it clear that they don't want this. Have those conversations with them, make sure that everything is okay. And then the last thing is, if something happens and your tenancy is terminated for whatever reason, say you're evicted, that subtenant cannot stay there unless they have approved it all through the landlord and everything. Chances are that's not going to be possible. So I do want to make sure that you're thinking of it in terms of, I've signed this lease and I've agreed to all of these things. in order to rent this space. And this person who is subletting from me also has to agree to all these things in order to rent this place from me. So here are some of our things. As I mentioned, your Facebook, we've got our off-campus page. This is kind of a screenshot of the main page, and I've linked it there above. Brooke, if you don't mind, if you can put that link in the chat box, that'd be fantastic. There are some mentions at the top. We've got our housing, if you're looking specifically for housing only. Some of the filters in that housing area include looking for sublets, so that's an option. You can go to the roommates page and use a lot of the filter functions there to find people either who are looking to rent a space or looking for a space, something like that. Very similar. And then of course our Canvas site, which we're going to show you a little brief little thing of the syllabus section, excuse me, which is more being used as an about me section a little bit later on. So some of the useful things that you want to make sure you're sharing with potential subtenants: what are the costs? What, how much does the rent cost? What's the potential for utilities costing? How does that breakdown work? What are your expectations of them living in that space? How long are they going to be in that space? What's the dates? Say for instance, it's only over the summer, but you intend on coming back beginning of August, but your lease starts in June, making sure that they understand they can utilize the space June and July, and you'll be back on August 1st and they need to be out by August 1st. Some people do also rent their furniture, so that's something to really talk about as well. Because you're renting your furniture, say you do want to make sure that you have some sort of agreement with them that if something's broken, they're going to be responsible for it. Sometimes people, landlords, or in your case, a sub-landlord, I'm not sure if that's the correct phrasing, but sometimes they will draft up some sort of a similar lease, make sure that it's signed, ensure that there's like maybe a deposit that's left in order to cover any damages or anything like that. It's a little bit more complicated with the deposit process. And I go over a lot of this in our off-campus housing webinars, just because there are particular laws in Massachusetts of how deposits are supposed to be handled. And so before you put that in any sort of contract or anything like that, make sure you follow up with the specific laws there, because you do want to ensure that you're not breaking the law while you're doing this. And a lot of that could be putting the deposit in an interest-bearing account. That's something that is required by the state of Massachusetts. But if you're subletting a space and they're only renting it for a couple of months, how does that process work? Those are all things that we're going to be posting on this site. Of course, you want to make sure that they know all the house expectations, whether it's specifics of living with your roommates, or maybe it's something that the landlord has shared with you. You're supposed to take out the trash. There's no parking in the parking lot, or whatever the case is. Those are all really important things. You also want to make sure that, like I said before, they get along with your roommates. They understand your roommates' personalities. Everybody is going to click well. And then last but not least, what are those non-negotiables? Talk about, what you think is a non-negotiable, what your roommates think are non-negotiables with this person, and what this person actually thinks are non-negotiables. I always think it's really important to sit down with everybody just to kind of put it on the table, be upfront. Since most of you have already lived in on-campus housing, you know that something that we do is that roommate agreement at the start of the year. And a lot of what that does is ensure that if something arises that is against something we've agreed to, we can have a conversation about it. Sometimes those difficult conversations need to be had early on so that it's not so difficult to talk about them later. For instance, hey, you sleep through your alarm all the time and it wakes me up and I don't have class until 12 p.m., whatever the case is. And we agreed earlier that you would not do that. So how do we work through this process? And it goes over a lot of things that people don't really think about. So I definitely recommend taking some pointers from those housing agreements, just so you could know what type of stuff you're looking for these potential subletters. So here's a screenshot of our new Canvas site. I've got 2 QR codes that are up on the screen. The first one is for the Canvas site itself. So feel free, if you're looking at this on your computer screen, to grab your cell phone if you've got a smartphone and just kind of scan that QR code. It'll take you straight to the Canvas site. You'll log in with your regular Tufts username and whatnot, and you should be able to self-register for this page. And then also our FAQs question, like I said, please either pass that along to your friends, submit some questions that you might have. And it is really going to be helpful for us when we're actually doing our FAQ section, which we will have also available on this page. Much of the information from this presentation is going to be available on this page. We will be posting the presentation itself, both on our off-campus page as well as this site. And we will be presenting some sort of a link to our YouTube page so that you can catch the recording at a later date. Okay, so like I said, this is going to be a very quick presentation. It looks like we've made it about 27 minutes, so that's fantastic. As I mentioned, feel free to use these QR codes, but if you have any questions now, we're definitely here. We've got the space really booked until at least 8:30, even though I don't think we're going to need it for that long, but feel free to put some questions in the chat box and we can go ahead and do that. We'll give you a few minutes to do so, but if we don't get anything at this point, we'll just end a little bit early and you all can carry on. I know we're in finals, so I want to make sure that everybody has what they need. Okay, so it looks like we have a question. How would you recommend beginning to look for someone to sublet for over this upcoming summer? How likely do you reckon it'll be to get one? Chances of getting one, I can't speak to. That is a difficult question because it really would determine, it would be different depending on the people. And it really depends on what people need. One thing I would suggest for summer sublets is to be a little bit more open and keep in mind that, you know, Boston is a really big city. It has a lot of people who are coming here over the summer to do internships. And so if you're comfortable, I don't want anybody to do anything they're not comfortable with, but I do recommend making sure it's open enough so that way folks can actually try and get it even if they're not a Tufts student. I think that the important thing to recommend is, or the important thing to realize, excuse me, is that here at Tufts, we're only a short distance outside of Boston. And especially the good thing about that is the housing costs are going to be lower than they would be if they were in the city. So opening up the possibility for people who are not just Tufts students can really be helpful for doing that. I'd recommend to start looking by posting on these sites. Keep in mind that the Canvas site that we've spoken about is specific to Tufts students, but you're more than welcome to post on the off-campus site, which I've linked in the chat box. In addition to class Facebook pages, some people just paste things in the Facebook marketplace. That is a potential option. I'm always a little bit weary about posting on things like Craigslist and whatnot, but there's still options. And at the end of the day, you still want to vet anybody that you're potentially renting to, whether they're a Tufts student or not. At the end of the day, this is someone you need to be able to trust can live in your space. So you do want to make sure that you have that. That's a lot of times when you have people who will request a renter's recommendation, like get some letters of, you know, approval from former landlords and whatnot. So I'd recommend trying some of those options.
Yeah, just like Angie said, like a lot of people want to come to Boston for summer internships. I've had friends who have contacted their high school group chat or whatever and saw if people want, like who they knew from their past who want to do an internship in Boston would want to do that. But that's also up to your comfort zone. And if you really did want a subletter, if you would go to having people from outside of Tufts.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, are you looking for internships or anything in the area? Obviously, it'd probably be a little bit easier if you were here too, but that's something that, is also a possibility. Also, I will throw this out there. A lot of times students in the area are living in spaces where it's anywhere from 3 to should be 4, sometimes more people living in an apartment. Say you're the only person of the bunch of your group that is living in the space. It is important to have that conversation with them. Just because you're the only person that is potentially living in that space does not mean that you should be responsible for the entire cost. So your other friends, your housemates and whatnot, they should also be going through this process if they don't plan on being in the space for a period of time, or keeping in mind that they are going to be responsible for the rent. So any leases that you all have, be sure that everybody's name is on that lease, because everybody is responsible for it, and never want to run into a situation where you all are in a boat where you're completely responsible for something and nobody else is doing the work in the group project. Give just a couple more minutes if anybody else has any additional questions. Okay, so what I think we're going to do, we're going to end a little bit early. If you think of any additional questions at a later time, we've got our contact information up on the screen, as well as the QR codes to be able to submit stuff. As I mentioned, this is being recorded, and so we will be posting this information up on our website. It'll be on the Tufts website for off-campus housing. It'll be on the linked website in the chat box, offcampus.tufts.edu, and it will be available on the Canvas site. Please tell your friends to take a look at it. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. And I'm going to wish you all luck in your finals and the rest of the semester.